In just 4 years, a single disease killed more people than all the wars in human history combined. This is the story of the plague that brought the mighty Byzantine Empire to its knees and changed the course of civilization forever. Welcome to Ancient Echoes, where we uncover the forgotten chapters that shaped our world. Today we journey back to the 6th century to witness one of history's most devastating pandemics, the Plague of Justinian. A catastrophe so immense that it altered the course of human civilization, yet remains largely unknown to the modern world. To understand the magnitude of this disaster, we must first understand the world it destroyed. The year was 541 AD, and the Byzantine Empire stood at the height of its power under Emperor Justinian I. Constantinople, the new Rome, was the crown jewel of the civilized world. With over 1 million inhabitants, it was the largest city on earth. The great walls that had protected it for over a century seemed impregnable. The dome of Hagia Sophia, completed just 14 years earlier, soared 180 feet above the city, a testament to human achievement and divine glory. Justinian himself was a man of extraordinary ambition. Born a peasant in a small village in modern-day North Macedonia, he had risen through cunning intelligence and the favor of his uncle, Emperor Justin I. When Justin died in 527 AD, Justinian inherited not just a throne, but a dream, the restoration of the Roman Empire to its former glory. By 541, that dream seemed within reach. Justinian's brilliant general Belisarius had reconquered much of North Africa from the Vandals. Sicily and parts of Italy had been wrested from the Ostrogoths. The Mediterranean was once again becoming a Roman lake. The emperor had also revolutionized law with his famous Corpus Juris Civilis, a comprehensive legal code that would influence jurisprudence for over a millennium. The empire's economy was booming. Trade routes connected Constantinople to India, China, and the far reaches of Europe. The city's harbors were filled with ships carrying silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, and precious stones from Ceylon. The sound of multiple languages filled the markets as merchants from across the known world conducted their business. But this prosperity created the very conditions that would lead to catastrophe. The dense urban population, the constant flow of trade goods, and the interconnected nature of the Byzantine world would soon become pathways for death itself. The social structure of the empire was complex and stratified. At the top sat the emperor, believed to be God's representative on earth. Below him were the nobility, wealthy merchants, skilled artisans, and at the bottom slaves and the urban poor. Each group lived in distinct quarters of the city, yet all were interconnected through the web of daily life. Religion played a central role in Byzantine society. Christianity was not just the state religion, but the lens through which people understood their world. The emperor was seen as God's chosen ruler, and the empire itself as a divine institution. This religious worldview would profoundly influence how people interpreted the coming plague. The military was professional and well-equipped, with soldiers recruited from across the empire and beyond. Many were Germanic or Slavic mercenaries who fought for pay and the promise of Roman citizenship. The famous Varangian Guard, composed of Viking warriors, protected the emperor himself. Agriculture formed the backbone of the economy. Egypt in particular was crucial as the empire's breadbasket. Every year, massive grain ships sailed from Alexandria to Constantinople, carrying the wheat that fed the capital's enormous population. These same ships would soon carry something far more deadly than they ever imagined. The intellectual life of the empire was flourishing. The University of Constantinople was the premier center of learning in the Christian world. Scholars preserved and studied the works of ancient Greek philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists. The famous historian Procopius was at this very time documenting Justinian's wars and achievements, having no idea he would soon record one of history's greatest catastrophes. To understand where the plague came from, we must look beyond the Byzantine Empire to the vast trade networks that connected the ancient world. The disease that would devastate the empire had its origins in the remote highlands of Central Asia, in regions that are now part of modern-day Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. The pathogen responsible was Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that naturally lives in populations of wild rodents. For thousands of years, it had circulated among marmots, ground squirrels, and other burrowing animals in the steppes of Central Asia. These animals had developed a stable relationship with the bacterium. It lived within them without causing the explosive outbreaks that would characterize its interaction with human populations. The key to understanding the plague spread lies in understanding its vector, the flea, specifically fleas of the genus Xenopsilla and Pulex. These tiny insects acted as living syringes, transferring the bacterium from animal to animal. Under normal circumstances, the plague remained confined to its natural hosts, in remote regions far from human habitation. But the 6th century was not a normal time. Climate change was altering the world in ways that contemporary people could barely comprehend. The period from approximately 536 to 550 AD is known to modern climatologists as the Late Antique Little Ice Age. Volcanic eruptions, possibly including a massive explosion in Indonesia, had thrown vast amounts of ash and sulfur into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and causing global cooling. This climate change had catastrophic effects on agriculture worldwide. Crops failed repeatedly, leading to famine and social upheaval. In China, the Northern Wei dynasty collapsed. In Europe, tree ring data shows that growth virtually stopped in many regions. This was the context in which the plague bacterium began its journey toward human civilization. The cooling climate forced the wild rodent populations of Central Asia to migrate in search of food and suitable habitat. As they moved, they came into contact with human settlements for the first time in centuries. When the infected wild rodents died, their fleas needed new hosts, and found them among the black rats that lived alongside humans. The black rat, Rattus rattus, was the perfect vehicle for the plague spread. Unlike their wild cousins, black rats lived in close association with humans. They infested grain stores, ships, and houses. They were also excellent travelers, capable of surviving long sea voyages in the holds of merchant vessels. The plague's journey from Central Asia to the Byzantine Empire was not direct. It followed the ancient trade routes, spreading from settlement to settlement, port to port. Archaeological evidence suggests it may have first reached the Persian Empire, where it caused significant disruption before moving westward. The disease likely entered Byzantine territory through several routes simultaneously. Caravans traveling the Silk Road brought it overland through Armenia and Anatolia. But the most significant pathway was maritime, through the trade connections that linked the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. Egypt, with its position as a crucial link between the Indian Ocean trade networks and the Mediterranean world, became a critical point in the plague spread. The bacterium likely arrived in Egyptian ports through ships coming from the Red Sea, carrying goods from India and beyond. From there, it was only a matter of time before it reached the grain ships that regularly sailed to Constantinople. The irony was profound. The very trade networks that had made the Byzantine Empire wealthy and powerful became the arteries through which death flowed. The interconnectedness that Justinian saw as a source of strength became a source of unprecedented vulnerability. Modern genetic analysis of plague DNA from this period has revealed that the strain responsible for the Justinian plague was particularly virulent. It possessed genetic mutations that made it especially deadly to humans who had no previous exposure to the disease. This was humanity's first encounter with this particular evolutionary variant of Yersinia pest. The first recorded outbreak of what would become known as the Plague of Justinian occurred in the Egyptian port city of Pelusium in 544. Pelusium, located in the Nile Delta near the modern-day Suez Canal, was a bustling commercial center that served as a gateway between the Red Sea trade and the Mediterranean world. The contemporary historian Evagrius Scholasticus, who would later survive the plague himself, described the initial outbreak with chilling precision. According to his account, the disease appeared suddenly and without warning. Merchants and dock workers, who had seemed perfectly healthy in the morning, were found dead by evening. The symptoms were unlike anything the local physicians had ever encountered. Victims developed sudden high fevers, often accompanied by delirium and severe headaches. Within hours, painful swellings called buboes appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck. These swellings, about the size of almonds or eggs, gave the disease its eventual name, bubonic plague. But not all victims developed bubo. Some suffered from what modern medicine recognizes as septicemic plague, where the bacteria directly invaded the bloodstream. These victims often died even more quickly, sometimes within hours of showing the first symptoms. Their bodies would turn black from internal bleeding, leading to the disease being called the Black Death, a name that would later be applied to the 14th century outbreak. A third form, pneumonic plague, was perhaps the most terrifying of all. In these cases, the bacteria infected the lungs, causing victims to cough up blood and spread the disease through respiratory droplets. Unlike bubonic plague, which required flea bites for transmission, pneumonic plague could spread directly from person to person through the air. The speed of death was what most terrified those who witnessed it. Procopius, the great Byzantine historian who documented the plague firsthand, wrote, "Death came in many forms. With some people the fever was so acute that it killed them immediately. With others, boils appeared on various parts of the body. These grew to the size of a large nut and proved fatal. Some victims fell into a deep coma and died without regaining consciousness. In Pelusium, the local authorities initially tried to contain the outbreak through traditional means. They consulted physicians, made offerings to saints, and imposed quarantines on infected households. But the disease spread faster than any human response could match. Within weeks, the death toll had overwhelmed the city's ability to cope. The economic impact was immediate and severe. Ships arriving at Pelusium found empty harbors and abandoned warehouses. Those brave enough to dock and conduct business often brought death back with them to their home ports. The carefully orchestrated trade networks that had operated for centuries began to break down as fear replaced commerce. Egypt's role as the granary of the Byzantine Empire made the situation particularly catastrophic. The annual grain fleet that sailed from Alexandria to Constantinople was crucial for feeding the capital's massive population. But now these ships carried more than wheat. They carried death itself. The plague spread along the Nile with terrifying efficiency. River traffic, which had connected Egyptian cities for thousands of years, became a vector for disaster. Memphis, the ancient capital, was devastated. Sion, modern Aswan in the far south, reported massive casualties. Even the isolated monasteries of the Egyptian desert were not spared. The social fabric of Egyptian society began to unravel. The highly stratified system that had governed life along the Nile for millennia collapsed as death struck all classes equally. Wealthy merchants died alongside their slaves. Christian bishops succumbed as quickly as pagan priests. The disease recognized no social boundaries. Agricultural production, already stressed by the climate changes of the previous years, collapsed entirely in many regions. Farmers fled their fields, abandoning crops at crucial times in the growing season. The complex irrigation systems that had made Egyptian agriculture possible for thousands of years fell into disrepair as the knowledge and manpower needed to maintain them disappeared. Religious responses to the plague varied dramatically. Many Christians saw it as divine punishment for sin and called for increased piety and repentance. Some bishops organized massive processions and prayer sessions, unknowingly creating perfect conditions for the disease to spread. Others retreated to isolated monasteries, hoping to wait out the catastrophe. The Coptic Christian community, which made up a significant portion of Egypt's population, was particularly hard hit. Their close-knit communities and frequent religious gatherings created ideal conditions for transmission. Many ancient Coptic manuscripts from this period end abruptly, their scribes presumably dead from the plague. As spring turned to summer in 541 AD, the annual grain fleet prepared to depart from Alexandria for Constantinople. This was normally a time of great activity and anticipation. The ships that would carry Egypt's wheat harvest to the capital were massive vessels for their time, capable of carrying hundreds of tons of grain. The ship captains and their crews were experienced professionals who had made this journey many times before. They knew the winds and currents of the eastern Mediterranean, the safe harbors where they could shelter from storms, and the complex procedures for loading and unloading their precious cargo. But this year was different. Reports of the strange disease in the Egyptian ports had reached Alexandria, but the economic pressures to maintain the grain supply were enormous. Constantinople depended on these shipments for survival. Delay could mean famine in the capital, something that could threaten the stability of the entire empire. The decision to proceed with the grain shipments would prove to be one of the most consequential in human history. Unknown to the sailors and merchants, they were about to become the vectors for a pandemic that would reshape the world. The ships themselves were perfect environments for the plague's spread. The holds were filled with grain that attracted rats, and the close quarters ensured that any disease would spread rapidly among the crew. The journey from Alexandria to Constantinople typically took about 2 weeks, depending on weather conditions, just enough time for the plague to incubate and spread throughout the ship. Contemporary accounts describe ships arriving in Constantinople's harbors with their entire crews dead or dying. The magnificent vessels that should have brought life-sustaining grain instead brought death itself. Harbor masters who boarded these ghost ships found scenes of horror, corpses scattered throughout the vessel, rats roaming freely through the grain, and the few survivors raving with fever and delirium. The great harbor of Constantinople, normally a scene of bustling activity, began to take on an increasingly ominous atmosphere. Word spread quickly among the dock workers about the cursed ships from Egypt. Many refused to unload them, but economic necessity and imperial commands eventually forced them to handle the contaminated cargo. The first cases in Constantinople appeared in the harbor district, among the stevedores and warehouse workers who handled the Egyptian grain. The disease spread outward from there, following the networks of daily life that connected all parts of the great city. The urban environment of Constantinople was perfectly designed for a pandemic. The city's population of over 1 million people was packed into a relatively small area. Multi-story apartment buildings housed dozens of families in close quarters. The narrow streets were filled with vendors, artisans, and pedestrians going about their daily business. The city's water supply, while advanced for its time, created additional vectors for disease transmission. Public fountains and bathhouses brought people together in ways that facilitated the spread of illness. The complex sewer system, a marvel of Byzantine engineering, may have also provided pathways for rats and fleas to move throughout the city. Emperor Justinian initially received reports of the plague with skepticism. After all, Constantinople had weathered many challenges before. The Great Walls had protected it from barbarian invasions, and imperial authority had always been sufficient to maintain order. How serious could a disease really be? But as the death toll mounted, it became clear that this was no ordinary outbreak. The palace's own servants began falling ill. Members of the imperial court, who lived in relative isolation from the common people, found themselves facing the same terrifying symptoms as the poorest dock workers. The emperor's advisors struggled to understand what was happening. In an age before germ theory, there were many competing explanations for disease. Some blamed bad air or miasma emanating from swamps and sewers. Others saw it as divine punishment for sin. Still others suspected poisoning by enemies of the empire. Medical knowledge of the time was largely based on the ancient works of Galen and Hippocrates, whose theories about the balance of bodily humors were useless against the plague. Physicians tried bloodletting, purging, and various herbal remedies, but nothing seemed to help. Many doctors died while treating patients, further reducing the medical resources available to combat the crisis. The psychological impact of the plague's arrival in Constantinople was enormous. This was the center of the civilized world, the city that called itself the New Rome. If death could reach here, no place was safe. The confidence and optimism that had characterized Justinian's reign began to give way to fear and despair. Religious leaders struggled to provide explanations and comfort to their flocks. Some preached that the plague was a test of faith, while others saw it as a sign of the approaching end times. Church services became both sources of spiritual comfort and venues for disease transmission. By the autumn of 5041 AD, the plague had penetrated every level of Byzantine society, from the humblest slaves to the highest nobles. But nothing prepared the empire for the shock of learning that Emperor Justinian himself had fallen victim to the disease. The news was initially kept secret by palace officials who understood the potential for panic and political instability if word spread that the emperor was dying. Justinian, at the height of his power and ambition, was confined to his bed in the sacred precincts of the great palace, fighting for his life against the same disease that was devastating his subjects. The emperor's illness represented far more than just a personal tragedy. In the Byzantine conception of government, the emperor was not merely a political leader, but God's chosen representative on earth. His health and well-being were seen as directly connected to the fate of the empire itself. If God's chosen ruler could fall to disease, what did that say about the empire's relationship with the divine? Theodora, Justinian's brilliant and formidable wife, took effective control of the government during her husband's illness. A former actress who had risen from humble origins to become one of history's most powerful women, Theodora proved herself more than capable of managing the crisis. She coordinated relief efforts, maintained communication with provincial governors, and most importantly, kept the government functioning while her husband hovered between life and death. The empress faced an almost impossible situation. The plague was devastating the capital, while simultaneously threatening the empire's military campaigns. Belisarius, Justinian's greatest general, was in the middle of his Italian campaign against the Ostrogoths when news of the emperor's illness reached him. Without clear direction from Constantinople, military operations began to stall. The economic implications of the emperor's illness were equally severe. Tax collection, already disrupted by the plague's impact on agriculture and trade, virtually ceased in many provinces. Provincial governors, unsure of their authority in the absence of clear imperial directives, hesitated to make important decisions. The carefully constructed administrative machine that Justinian had spent years perfecting began to break down. Religious authorities faced their own crisis of interpretation. If the emperor was God's chosen ruler, why had he been struck down by disease? Some saw it as divine displeasure with Justinian's policies, particularly his attempts to reconcile with the Monophysite Christians, whom Orthodox clergy considered heretical. Others interpreted it as a test of the emperor's faith, similar to the trials faced by biblical figures like Job. The palace itself became a microcosm of the plague's broader impact. Servants, guards, administrators, and court officials fell ill in rapid succession. The elaborate ceremonial life of the Byzantine court, with its intricate protocols and daily rituals, ground to a halt. The very symbols of imperial power seemed powerless against invisible death. Justinian's own experience of the disease was harrowing. According to Procopius, who had access to court sources, the emperor developed the characteristic bubonic swellings and suffered from severe fever and delirium. For days his life hung in the balance as the best physicians in the empire struggled to treat him. The emperor's illness also highlighted the limitations of 6th century medicine. Despite having access to the most learned doctors and the most expensive treatments available, Justinian received essentially the same ineffective care as his poorest subjects. The democratic nature of the plague, its indifference to wealth, power, and status, was never more clearly demonstrated. During his delirium, Justinian reportedly spoke of visions and prophetic dreams. Some courtiers interpreted these as divine revelations, while others saw them as merely the ravings of a fevered mind. The emperor claimed to have seen armies of angels and demons fighting over the fate of his empire, with the outcome still uncertain. The question of succession loomed large during the crisis. Justinian and Theodora had no children, and the emperor had not clearly designated an heir. Various relatives and court officials began positioning themselves for a potential power struggle, even as they maintained public facades of concern for the emperor's recovery. Theodora's handling of these potential rivals was masterful. She managed to maintain unity among the court factions while preventing any premature moves toward succession. Her political skills, honed during years of navigating the treacherous waters of Byzantine court politics, proved essential during this critical period. The empress also had to manage the public perception of the crisis. She authorized carefully crafted announcements about the emperor's condition, providing enough information to prevent panic while avoiding details that might encourage his enemies. The balance between transparency and security was delicate and crucial. International implications of Justinian's illness were significant. The Persian Empire, Byzantium's traditional rival, was watching events carefully and considering whether to take advantage of Byzantine weakness. Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier were also monitoring the situation, as were the Ostrogoths in Italy, who were fighting against Belisarius. As the plague reached its peak intensity in Constantinople during the winter of 541–542 AD, the very foundations of Byzantine society began to crumble. The carefully maintained social order that had governed the empire for centuries proved inadequate in the face of mass death and terror. The death toll reached staggering proportions. According to Evagrius Scholasticus, who lived through the plague in Constantinople, the daily death count reached 16,000 at its peak. This number, if accurate, would have meant that nearly 2% of the city's population was dying every single day. Procopius claimed that the total death toll eventually reached 300,000 people in the capital alone. The city's infrastructure for dealing with death was quickly overwhelmed. Constantinople's cemeteries, designed for normal mortality rates, could not accommodate the sudden influx of corpses. Traditional burial practices, which were important for both religious and social reasons, became impossible to maintain. Initially, families tried to give their dead proper burials according to Christian customs. Bodies were washed, wrapped in shrouds, and interred in consecrated ground after appropriate funeral services. But as the death toll mounted, these practices became increasingly difficult to sustain. The shortage of burial space led to increasingly desperate measures. Theodora ordered the construction of massive pits outside the city walls, where bodies could be buried in layers. These plague pits, as they came to be known, represented a complete breakdown of the normal social distinctions that governed death in Byzantine society. Rich and poor, noble and commoner, were buried together in anonymous mass graves. Even these mass burials proved insufficient as the plague reached its peak. Contemporary sources describe bodies piling up in the streets, left unburied for days or even weeks. The normal human instinct to care for the dead was overwhelmed by the practical impossibility of dealing with so many corpses, combined with the fear that handling plague victims might spread the disease. The economic consequences were catastrophic. Constantinople's complex market system, which supplied food and goods to over 1 million people, began to break down as merchants, craftsmen, and laborers died or fled the city. Basic necessities became scarce and expensive. Bread, the staple food of the urban masses, became difficult to obtain as bakers died and grain supplies from plague-stricken Egypt became unreliable. The city's famous silk workshops, which produced luxury goods for export throughout the Mediterranean world, shut down as skilled workers succumbed to the disease. The loss of these specialized craftsmen represented not just an immediate economic blow, but a long-term reduction in the empire's industrial capacity. Constantinople's role as a major trading center was severely compromised. Merchants from other cities and countries were reluctant to visit what had become known as a city of death. Those who did come often found their usual business contacts dead, and the commercial networks they relied upon in chaos. The plague also disrupted the empire's tax collection system, which was crucial for funding the military and administration. Provincial governors reported massive population losses that made it impossible to collect normal tax revenues. Rural areas were particularly hard hit, as agricultural communities had fewer resources to cope with the crisis. Social order deteriorated as traditional authority structures collapsed. With so many officials, priests, and community leaders dead or incapacitated, there was often no one left to maintain order or provide leadership. Crime increased as normal law enforcement mechanisms broke down. Some people responded to the crisis with increased religious devotion, seeing the plague as divine punishment that required repentance and prayer. Churches were filled with desperate worshippers seeking divine intervention. Processions and public prayers became common, though these gatherings often facilitated the disease's spread. Others responded with despair and hedonism, believing that death was inevitable and that they might as well enjoy their final days. Contemporary sources describe wild parties and orgies as people abandoned moral restraints in the face of apparent doom. The normal social controls that governed behavior seemed meaningless when death could strike at any moment. The plague also revealed and exacerbated existing social tensions. Some blamed specific groups for causing the disease, leading to persecution of minorities, foreigners, and religious dissidents. The Jewish community in Constantinople faced particular hostility as they were scapegoated by some Christians who blamed them for divine displeasure. Family structures, the basic building blocks of Byzantine society, were devastated. Entire households died within days of each other, leaving children orphaned and elderly people without care. The extended family networks that normally provided social support were often completely destroyed. The plague's impact on women was particularly severe in some ways. Pregnant women faced additional risks, and many children lost their mothers during or shortly after childbirth. The high mortality rate among infants and children meant that many family lines were permanently extinguished. Religious communities were also devastated. Monasteries and convents, with their close communal living arrangements, were particularly vulnerable to plague transmission. Many ancient religious communities that had existed for centuries were completely wiped out, taking with them irreplaceable manuscripts, traditions, and knowledge. Despite the overwhelming catastrophe of the plague, the Byzantine Empire did not simply collapse. Led by the remarkable Empress Theodora and a corps of surviving administrators, the government mounted an extraordinary effort to maintain essential services and prevent total social breakdown. Theodora's response to the crisis demonstrated the qualities that had made her one of history's most formidable rulers. Working from the Great Palace, she coordinated relief efforts across the empire while simultaneously managing the political challenges posed by her husband's illness and the general crisis of authority. One of her first priorities was maintaining food supplies to Constantinople. With the normal grain shipments from Egypt disrupted by the plague, the city faced the prospect of famine, in addition to disease. Theodora ordered emergency grain purchases from provinces that were less affected by the plague, including supplies from the Black Sea region and the Balkans. The Empress also recognized the need to maintain public order and morale. She increased the bread distributions that the government provided to Constantinople's citizens, even though this strained the imperial treasury. These distributions were not just about preventing hunger. They were symbolic demonstrations that the government was still functioning and caring for its people. Medical responses to the plague were limited by the scientific knowledge of the time, but some physicians and administrators did develop practical strategies that may have helped reduce transmission. Some doctors recommended avoiding crowds and maintaining distance from infected people, advice that aligns with modern understanding of disease prevention, even though it was based on incorrect theories about bad air. Quarantine measures were implemented sporadically, though their effectiveness was limited by poor understanding of how the disease spread. Some wealthy families isolated themselves in countryside estates, while certain neighborhoods attempted to seal themselves off from the rest of the city. These measures probably had some limited success, particularly when they accidentally reduced contact with rats and fleas. The government also worked to maintain essential services. Fire brigades continued to operate, as fire was a constant threat in a city built largely of wood. The aqueducts that supplied Constantinople with water were kept functioning, recognizing that clean water was essential for health. Efforts were made to keep the streets clear of bodies, both for sanitary reasons and to maintain public morale. Communication with the provinces was a constant challenge. Many regional governors had died, and those who survived often faced local crises that prevented them from maintaining regular contact with the capital. Theodora worked to appoint new administrators and maintain the flow of information that was essential for governing the empire. The military situation was particularly complex, with Belisarius's army in Italy facing its own plague outbreak, and with Persian forces potentially threatening the eastern frontier. The empire faced external threats at its moment of greatest weakness. Theodora had to balance the need to maintain military readiness with the reality that many soldiers had died or deserted. Some military units were recalled from less critical frontiers to help maintain order in the capital and other major cities. Soldiers were tasked with removing bodies from the streets, maintaining quarantine measures, and preventing civil unrest. The military's organizational structure proved more resilient than civilian authorities in many cases. Religious leaders also played important roles in the empire's response to the crisis. While some clergy died alongside their flocks, others showed remarkable courage in caring for the sick and dying. Christian concepts of charity and care for the poor motivated many religious communities to establish hospitals and care centers, even at great risk to themselves. The church's organizational structure, which paralleled that of the civil government, provided an alternative network for communication and coordination when civilian administration broke down. Bishops and abbots often took on governmental roles in their localities, making decisions about resource allocation and public health measures. Theological responses to the plague varied widely. Some clergy preached that the disease was divine punishment for sin and called for increased penance and religious devotion. Others emphasized God's mercy and the importance of caring for fellow humans in times of crisis. These different interpretations had practical implications for how communities responded to the plague. International diplomacy continued despite the crisis. Theodora maintained communication with foreign courts, working to prevent enemies from taking advantage of Byzantine weakness. She also sought assistance from allied kingdoms, though most of the known world was facing similar plague outbreaks. The economic response to the plague required innovative thinking. With normal tax collection impossible in many areas, the government had to find alternative sources of revenue. Some emergency taxes were imposed on surviving wealthy individuals and communities that had been less affected by the disease. Trade relationships had to be restructured as traditional commercial networks collapsed. New trading partners were sought in regions that had been spared the worst of the plague. The government also worked to restart domestic production in essential industries, offering incentives to surviving craftsmen and encouraging the training of new workers. Despite these efforts, the empire's response to the plague was necessarily limited by the scientific and technological constraints of the 6th century. Without understanding of germ theory, effective medical treatments, or rapid communication systems, There was only so much that even the most capable administrators could accomplish. While Constantinople struggled with its catastrophe, the plague was simultaneously devastating communities across the known world. The same trade networks that had brought prosperity to the 6th century Mediterranean world now carried death to every corner of the inhabited earth. The disease spread westward through the Mediterranean with terrifying efficiency. Sicily, strategically located at the center of Mediterranean trade routes, was among the first Western territories to experience the full impact of the plague. The island's position as a crossroads between Africa, Europe, and the Eastern Mediterranean made it a perfect launching point for the disease's expansion. From Sicily, the plague spread to the Italian peninsula, where it intersected with Belisarius's ongoing campaign against the Ostrogoths. The Byzantine general found himself fighting a war on two fronts, against human enemies and against invisible death. His army, already stretched thin by years of campaigning, was decimated by the disease. The Ostrogoths, who had been steadily losing ground to Byzantine forces, suddenly found their situation transformed by the plague. While they suffered losses themselves, the disease hit the Byzantine army even harder, as the imperial forces were more dependent on complex supply lines and urban bases that facilitated disease transmission. Rome itself, the ancient capital that Justinian dreamed of reclaiming, was devastated by the plague. The city that had once ruled the known world saw its population reduced to perhaps 30,000 people, a shadow of its former greatness. Many of the ancient monuments and buildings that had survived barbarian invasions were abandoned as there were simply not enough people left to maintain them. Southern France experienced the plague through its connections to Mediterranean trade. The port cities of Marseille and Nice were among the first affected, as ships carrying infected rats arrived from plague-stricken ports in Italy and North Africa. From these coastal cities, the disease spread inland along river systems and trade routes. The Frankish kingdoms, which were gradually consolidating power in what would become medieval France, found their political development disrupted by the demographic catastrophe. Many local leaders died, leading to succession disputes and territorial conflicts that would shape the region's political landscape for generations. Spain, under Visigothic rule, also suffered severely from the plague. The Iberian Peninsula's extensive trade connections with North Africa made it particularly vulnerable. Cities like Seville and Córdoba, which had thrived under Roman rule and continued to prosper under the Visigoths, saw their populations devastated. The plague's impact on North Africa was particularly severe. The region had been recently reconquered by Belisarius and was still adapting to renewed Byzantine rule when the disease struck. The complex ethnic and religious divisions in the region between Romans, Berbers, Vandals, and various Christian denominations complicated efforts to respond to the crisis. Egypt, as we have seen, was the plague's entry point into the Mediterranean world, but the disease continued to rage there long after its initial appearance. The highly urbanized Nile Delta region was particularly vulnerable, while the more sparsely populated areas of Upper Egypt may have suffered less severe losses. The plague also spread eastward from its origins in Central Asia. The Persian Empire, Byzantium's great rival, experienced its own devastating outbreak. The Sassanid king Khosrow I, who had been planning to take advantage of Byzantine weakness, found his own kingdom facing similar challenges. The Persian response to the plague differed in some ways from the Byzantine approach, reflecting different cultural and religious traditions. Zoroastrian concepts of purity and pollution influenced how Persian society understood and responded to disease. Some Zoroastrian communities interpreted the plague as evidence of cosmic warfare between good and evil forces. Trade routes connecting Persia to Central Asia and India also carried the plague eastward. The Indian subcontinent experienced severe outbreaks, though detailed records from this period are scarce. What evidence we have suggests that major cities along the western coast, which were connected to Red Sea trade, were particularly hard hit. The plague may have reached China through the same Central Asian routes that had originally brought it westward. Chinese historical records from this period mention severe epidemics that could have been plague outbreaks, though the identification is not certain. If the plague did reach China, it would have represented a truly global pandemic, the first in recorded history. Northern Europe was initially spared the worst of the plague, largely because it was less connected to the Mediterranean trade networks through which the disease spread. However, some regions that had trade connections with the south, particularly areas along major river systems like the Rhine and Danube, did experience outbreaks. The Germanic tribes that had settled in former Roman territories faced their own plague crises. The Lombards in northern Italy, the Burgundians in eastern France, and various Saxon groups in Britain all encountered the disease as it spread through their territories. These societies, with their more decentralized political structures, often lacked the administrative capacity to mount coordinated responses to the crisis. Britain, recently abandoned by Roman administration and in the midst of Anglo-Saxon settlement, experienced plague outbreaks that may have influenced the island's political development. Some historians suggest that the demographic disruption caused by the plague helped facilitate Anglo-Saxon expansion into British territories as native populations were weakened by disease. Ireland, with its monastery-based culture and extensive connections to continental Europe through religious networks, also faced plague outbreaks. The island's numerous monasteries, which served as centers of learning and culture, suffered severe losses. Many irreplaceable manuscripts and traditions were lost, as entire religious communities were wiped out. The plague's global reach meant that it affected not just the political and economic structures of individual kingdoms, but the entire network of relationships that connected the ancient world. Trade routes that had operated for centuries were disrupted or abandoned. Cultural exchanges that had enriched human civilization were interrupted. The cosmopolitan world of the 6th century gave way to a more fragmented and isolated age. Against all odds, Emperor Justinian survived the plague. In early 542 AD, after months of illness that had brought him to death's door, the emperor began to show signs of recovery. His survival was seen by many as a divine miracle, proof that God had not abandoned his chosen ruler or the empire itself. Justinian's recovery was gradual and incomplete. Contemporary sources suggest that he never fully regained his former vigor, and that the illness left him changed both physically and mentally. Procopius, writing years later, claimed that the emperor became more suspicious and paranoid after his illness, though this assessment may have been influenced by the historian's later hostility toward Justinian. The emperor's return to active rule faced enormous challenges. The empire he had worked so hard to expand and strengthen was now devastated by plague and facing threats on multiple frontiers. The Italian campaign had stalled, the reconquest of North Africa was in jeopardy, and the Persian frontier required constant attention. Justinian's first priority was reasserting imperial authority. During his illness, various provincial governors and military commanders had been forced to make independent decisions, and some had begun to act with considerable autonomy. The emperor needed to re-establish central control while recognizing that the changed circumstances required new approaches to governance. The demographic catastrophe caused by the plague had fundamentally altered the empire's human resources. Entire communities of skilled craftsmen, experienced administrators, and trained soldiers had been wiped out. Rebuilding these capabilities would take generations, if it could be accomplished at all. Economic recovery proved particularly challenging. The empire's tax base had been devastated by the massive population losses. Traditional sources of revenue were no longer sufficient to fund the military and administrative apparatus that Justinian had built. New economic strategies were needed, but implementing them required administrative capacity that had been severely reduced by the plague. The emperor's ambitious building programs, which had included the construction of Hagia Sophia and numerous other monuments, had to be scaled back dramatically. The resources simply were not available to continue these projects at their former pace. Many building sites were abandoned, and planned constructions were never begun. Military reorganization was equally urgent and difficult. The professional army that had enabled Justinian's early conquests had been decimated by plague and warfare. Recruitment became more difficult as the population base had shrunk, and survivors were often reluctant to join military campaigns that might take them far from their families and communities. The emperor was forced to rely increasingly on barbarian mercenaries and allied troops, a strategy that brought its own risks and complications. These forces were expensive to maintain and often unreliable in critical situations. The empire's military capacity, while still formidable, was never again what it had been before the plague. Religious and cultural recovery presented additional challenges. Many of the empire's churches, monasteries, and schools had been devastated by the plague. The loss of educated clergy and teachers created a crisis in religious and secular education that would have long-term consequences for Byzantine intellectual life. Justinian's legal reforms, embodied in his famous law code, had to be adapted to the new realities created by the plague. Property law became particularly complex as entire families had died without clear heirs. The imperial government had to develop new procedures for dealing with abandoned property and unclear inheritance claims. The emperor's relationship with his subjects had also been fundamentally altered by the plague experience. The confident optimism that had characterized the early years of his reign gave way to a more cautious and defensive approach. The empire's citizens had seen that even imperial power could not protect them from invisible death, and this realization changed their relationship with authority. International relations required complete reassessment. The balance of power that had existed before the plague was now obsolete. The Persian Empire, despite suffering its own plague losses, was in relatively better condition than Byzantium and posed an increased threat. Germanic kingdoms in the west had also been affected by the plague, but some had recovered more quickly than others. Justinian's dream of restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory was now clearly impossible. The resources, both human and material, simply no longer existed. Instead, the emperor had to focus on consolidating and defending what remained of his territory, while accepting that expansion was no longer feasible. The plague had also revealed the vulnerabilities inherent in the empire's urban-centered, trade-dependent economy. The very interconnectedness that had been a source of strength had become a pathway for catastrophe. Some degree of decentralization and local self-sufficiency became necessary for survival. Despite these challenges, Justinian's later years did see some significant achievements. The emperor managed to maintain imperial control over the core territories of the empire and even achieved some military successes. His legal code remained influential, and his architectural legacy, particularly Hagia Sophia, continued to inspire and amaze visitors. The emperor's personal transformation during and after the plague also had theological implications. Justinian became more interested in religious questions and spent considerable time on theological discussions and ecclesiastical policy. Some historians argue that his plague experience deepened his religious faith and influenced his later attempts to achieve religious unity within the empire. The Plague of Justinian was not simply a temporary crisis that was overcome and forgotten. Instead, it marked a fundamental turning point in world history, ending one age and beginning another. The demographic, economic, and social changes it caused would reshape human civilization for centuries to come. The most immediate and obvious impact was demographic. Modern estimates suggest that the plague killed between 25 and 50 million people across the affected regions, roughly 13 to 26% of the total population of the known world. This represented the loss of perhaps 2 generations of human potential, with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate death toll. The age structure of surviving populations was severely distorted. Many children and elderly people had died, but so had large numbers of adults in their prime productive years. This created societies with unusual demographic profiles that affected everything from economic productivity to cultural transmission. Many skills, traditions, and knowledge systems were lost when their practitioners died without passing them on to the next generation. Urban centers, which had been the driving forces of ancient civilization, were particularly devastated. Cities that had grown continuously for centuries suddenly found themselves with populations that were fractions of their former size. Many urban amenities, theaters, baths, schools, markets, could no longer be maintained with the reduced populations and economic resources. This urban decline contributed to a broader process of decentralization and ruralization that would characterize the medieval period. The complex, interdependent economic systems that had characterized the late Roman world gave way to more localized, self-sufficient communities. Long-distance trade, while it never disappeared entirely, was reduced in scale and complexity. The plague's impact on knowledge and culture was profound and largely irreversible. The ancient world had preserved and transmitted learning through networks of schools, libraries, and scholarly communities. When these institutions were destroyed by the plague, much knowledge was lost forever. We can only guess at the scientific discoveries, literary works, and philosophical insights that died with their creators during the plague years. Educational systems took generations to recover, if they ever fully did. The combination of reduced populations, economic constraints, and social disruption made it difficult to maintain the schools and teachers necessary for widespread literacy and learning. This contributed to the intellectual decline that characterized much of Europe during the early medieval period. Religious and cultural life was also transformed. The plague experience influenced religious thought in complex ways. Some communities became more intensely religious, seeing the catastrophe as a call to greater piety and devotion. Others experienced crises of faith, questioning why a benevolent God would allow such suffering. The relative positions of different religious communities were altered by their varying responses to the plague crisis. Some groups that showed particular courage in caring for the sick gained increased respect and influence. Others that appeared to abandon their responsibilities during the crisis lost social standing. Political structures had to adapt to the new realities created by depopulation and economic decline. The centralized imperial systems that had characterized both the Byzantine and Persian empires became increasingly difficult to maintain. Local leaders and communities gained greater autonomy by necessity, beginning a trend toward the more decentralized political systems of the medieval period. Military organization also underwent fundamental changes. The professional armies that had dominated ancient warfare became too expensive to maintain, with reduced tax bases and populations. Military systems increasingly relied on local militias, barbarian mercenaries, and feudal obligations, rather than standing professional forces. The balance of power between settled agricultural societies and nomadic peoples shifted significantly. The demographic losses suffered by urban civilizations made them more vulnerable to raids and invasions by nomadic groups who had been less affected by the plague. This contributed to the success of various barbarian invasions and migrations during the 6th and 7th centuries. Trade and economic systems were fundamentally restructured. The complex long-distance trading networks that had connected Asia, Africa, and Europe were disrupted and simplified. Many specialized crafts and industries disappeared as their practitioners died and markets contracted. Economic life became more localized and less sophisticated. Technological development was also affected. The plague occurred during a period when various civilizations were making significant technological advances. The demographic catastrophe and social disruption slowed or halted many of these developments. Some technologies were lost entirely and had to be rediscovered centuries later. The plague's impact on women and family structures was particularly significant. With traditional family networks disrupted by death, women often found themselves in new roles and situations. Some gained greater independence and authority, while others faced increased vulnerability and hardship. Marriage patterns and family structures had to adapt to the new demographic realities. Agricultural systems were transformed by the combination of population loss and climate change. Many areas that had been intensively cultivated were abandoned and returned to wilderness. Agricultural techniques and knowledge were lost in some regions as farming communities were wiped out. The plague also had important environmental consequences. The massive population reduction led to changes in land use that affected local ecosystems. Forests recovered in some areas as agricultural pressure was reduced. Wildlife populations may have rebounded in regions that had been heavily settled. Art and architectural styles reflected the changed conditions of post-plague society. The confident, monumental style that had characterized late Roman and early Byzantine art gave way to more modest local traditions. Building projects became smaller in scale and more focused on practical rather than decorative purposes. Literary and historical traditions were also affected. Many chronicles and literary works that would have recorded the experiences and perspectives of plague-era societies were never written because their potential authors had died. This has created significant gaps in our historical knowledge of this crucial period. The psychological and cultural trauma of the plague experience influenced societies for generations. Communities that had experienced such massive losses developed different attitudes toward life, death, risk, and the future. This cultural shift contributed to the different worldview that characterized medieval civilization compared to its ancient predecessors. Some regions recovered more quickly than others, leading to new patterns of dominance and subordination. The rise of Islam in the 7th century, for example, was partly facilitated by the weakened condition of the Byzantine and Persian empires following the plague. The Plague of Justinian also established precedents and patterns that would influence responses to later pandemics. The social, economic, and political adaptations developed during this crisis provided models for dealing with similar catastrophes in the future. The experience gained during the 6th century plague may have influenced how societies responded to later outbreaks, including the Black Death of the 14th century. Perhaps most significantly, the plague marked the end of the ancient world and the beginning of what we now call the medieval period. The optimistic expansionist civilizations of late antiquity gave way to more defensive, localized societies focused on survival rather than growth. The demographic and economic foundations that had supported classical civilization were permanently altered. The Plague of Justinian was not just an epidemic, it was a civilizational transformation. In just a few years, it changed the trajectory of human development in ways that would influence the course of history for the next 1,000 years. The world that emerged from the plague was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before it, and many of those changes proved to be permanent. This transformation reminds us of the fragility of human civilization and the profound impact that natural catastrophes can have on the course of history. The Plague of Justinian stands as one of history's most dramatic examples of how an invisible enemy can accomplish what armies and invasions could not, the complete restructuring of human society. The legacy of this great pandemic extends far beyond its immediate victims. It shaped the medieval world, influenced the development of modern medicine and public health, and continues to inform our understanding of how societies respond to existential crises. In studying the Plague of Justinian, we learn not only about the past, but about the resilience and vulnerability that continue to characterize human civilization. As we reach the end of this long journey through one of history's darkest chapters, we are reminded that the Plague of Justinian was more than just a medical catastrophe. It was a pivot point in human civilization. In the span of just a few years, a microscopic organism altered the course of empires, ended the dreams of emperors, and reshaped the world in ways that would endure for centuries. Today, as we face our own global challenges and remember recent pandemic experiences, the story of Justinian's plague offers both sobering lessons and inspiring examples of human resilience. It reminds us that civilizations, no matter how powerful they may seem, remain vulnerable to forces beyond their control. But it also shows us that humanity has the capacity to survive, adapt, and eventually recover from even the most devastating catastrophes. The Plague of Justinian may have ended the ancient world, but it also began the medieval world. From the ashes of that great catastrophe emerged new forms of art, culture, politics, and human organization. The story of this plague is ultimately a story of transformation, painful, traumatic, but ultimately creative. This has been Ancient Echoes. Until our next journey into the forgotten chapters of human history, remember that the past is never truly past. It lives on in the world we inhabit today.